Well, great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Nyko's RPG, and we are going to be looking at a bunch of different subjects, not including that one. Alrighty, so what we are going to be talking about is the evolution of experience and how the way player advancement has occurred over time, and juxtaposing the way it works now versus the way it worked then, and offering a recommendation that is well above and beyond what's being used right now. So before we get started, make sure you go down below and press all the buttons so that the algorithm will know that you're part of our audience, and we will get started.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so as we indicate here, we are going to talk about experience. I've got the wrong header, so goodbye. We are going to be talking about the process of gaining experience in a role-play game, and we're going to be talking about it in the larger sense of talking about the very process for role-play games. Now, in its infancy, the role-playing game was originally designed as Dungeons & Dragons in particular was designed as a way to track the hero's progress on the hero's journey. In that traditional story basis, the idea is that your hero starts off as a individual who has nothing necessarily, doesn't have anything that necessarily recommends him. They're on a process of becoming more, becoming better and bigger and stronger, and therefore they by nature start weaker and eventually become stronger over the period of time of the game. The mechanism, therefore, was utilizing some form of scoring for the actions that an individual did to improve, to basically prove that he was improving. Therefore, as he did accomplish certain conditions or certain steps, he would become better and more accomplished at his effect. The reason the characters need to advance is that we are talking about a game. And if you are talking about a game, you need a scorekeeping mechanism. And initially, at least, the idea was that each thing that you did in the game would grant you a certain number of earned experience points. And then the game master would adjudicate those points to you as you went through the game. And you would trade those points fundamentally for advancement in skill, in ability, in physically getting better. And the way that manifested is that the number required for you to strike an opponent would go down, and it was incrementally so. And fundamentally, the entire mechanism was divided into the concept of levels, and each time you would, quote, earn a level, your saving throw would improve by 1. Generally speaking, your number required to hit an opponent would go down by 1. In theory, the amount of defense that you could protect yourself with would go up by 1, and so on. And in the early offings, that was fundamentally all the level ups were, is fundamentally just adding a new point to your attack value, reducing your armor by 1, and therefore making it harder for you to be hit. And this mechanism was required so that there would be progress in the game and you could see your personas advance. Well, as you face different challenges, the values of those points vary because of the difficulty of the size, shape, and type of the encounter. And so this process pretty quickly became fairly untenable for the average game master to track. It was harder and harder to be able to determine, well, if you fight a monster with a higher armor class, does that give the same benefit as fighting one that has a increased attack value? Are your points better spent in protection than they are in attack values. And so the balancing act began. Each character class, if you will, would have a different set of modifiers. The tracking of that advance would be different by the class because different things matter to different players. So a healer should get points for healing, and a warrior should get points for dealing damage, and a rogue should get points for the stuff that he acquired, and the like. And it became more and more difficult to express in terms of game type because the game master would have to do all of these maths individually to the players with which he was interacting. So then the question becomes, what do these experience points actually do? Now, in certain games, the mechanism, basically you earn your experience in some fashion, some numeric value, and then you use those to purchase advances. And in other games, like Dungeons and Dragons, you just keep accruing those points, and your name, your class name, for example, used to go up. Your title would go up, and the ease with which you hit, as I mentioned, goes up. It goes down. The ability to withstand damage goes up. And each game mechanism, therefore, would look at those experience in different ways and determine when you would be able to make these advances. So initially, the system was simply reward for action. You do an action, get the benefit of points. Do an action, get a benefit of points. But that, again, became problematic because one player can't do everything, and the other players need to be rewarded for what they did, even if it's not the same scale. And so the methodology became more difficult until they fundamentally came with the idea of the milestone. The idea is instead of number of actions, it's the number of weeks or the number of sessions that you've played in that provides you with these experience points that you can then spend. And this led, therefore, to a more lockstep advancement. In other words, as the players would move up, they would move up as a group, or nearly so. And therefore, it would only be periodically that you'd have to do the math and do the equations. Or you could actually go one step further, which was build a system that provided experience every time you played, regardless of what you did. And this became problematic only because there are game players who are wallflowers who don't have any experience in knowing what to do or don't know how to convey information within the game to get their opinion or their will heard. And therefore, the mechanisms start to lose their actual meaning, and the reward of the experience points, unfortunately, by most mechanisms, becomes automated to the point where you must have it. You simply must have those improvements because the monsters keep getting harder, the challenges become more difficult, and therefore you need to have more and more of these skill bonuses that are triggered by experience gain. So then the game master starts setting up arbitrary benchmarks. He just says, well, when we play through this, when we go from city to city, when you get to the next city, we will establish that you have accomplished enough to gain the experience points and therefore be able to go into your training, and they become less important other than as a requirement of advancement, and so that the players no longer have a correlation between what they are doing and what they're receiving. Instead, now they're looking forward to gaining the advancements, whether they do anything or not. And this actually promotes the concept of not doing anything. So you end up, it's counterintuitive. Your players choose not to go on an adventure or do not risk something, knowing that you still are going to benchmark them experience on a arbitrary basis, and therefore they'll still get their advancement. And therefore now you've underplayed the very value of the experience, which now means that you fundamentally destroyed the very hero's journey mechanism that the experience points were meant to be. So this dilution of the value of the experience points makes the very equation of determining what an action's experience is worth fundamentally a moot point. But here's the real thing. When you're talking about a game which has the idea of the players becoming more experienced at something, you really still need to be able to show the progress. But the players are the ones that benefit from the progress increase. You as a storyteller are able to unleash more dangerous monsters when they have the points, but it's not on the basis of those points that they have value. And so therefore the arbitrary nature of power creep in role-playing games becomes much more evident. As a matter of fact, it gets to the point where, for example, in organized play, the encounter requires a certain CR rating to be considered valid, and so therefore now you've got to automatically ratchet the encounter danger level, even if the story wouldn't normally warrant it, because it's required for the players to advance. And so this progress now no longer means anything to the player other than, the from Little Shop of Horrors, you get the idea of feed me Seymour. Your players simply want and crave and need those experience points in order to stay equitable with one another and to advance, progress, become better, stronger. And this is the scoreboard. People often ask, can you win at Dungeons and Dragons? And I did a video on it. In fact, I'll put a link up here for that video. But when I speak of winning, what I'm referring to is having a better play experience. What they are referring to when they say winning is you are achieving the goals set within the game. I'm going to advance by so many levels, by so many sessions, and therefore be able to progress the storyline as I, as the player, want to see it, regardless of the greater story. And therefore now we have completely divorced the idea of the progress from the course of the adventure altogether. So here's the real problem. When we are talking about making something into a game, when you're talking about a role-playing game, what you're fundamentally talking about is taking a story process whereby you're going to tell a story and your players are going to interact, and as certain persons will point out, in the case of a sandbox, the collective player base will build out the story. But the real challenge comes back to this gamification mechanism. You have to have some way for the player's advancement to feel like it's part of their game. Therefore, you're almost mandated to keep this idea of your experience points in place, even though the players are no longer paying attention to it from a story standpoint. So therefore, you have unfortunately now put into place a mechanism that makes your play experience absolutely a game, instead of having it be the narrative storytelling mechanism that it originated as. And this gamification mechanism now is overtaking and undermining the very entertainment value that the games could or used to provide. And that is because in most people's thought process, advancement equals improvement. In other words, I'm moving forward, so I should get better at things. And while that is true if we are putting in the practice those things that we've learned, if you're talking about it from a game's mechanics standpoint, it does nothing. It does nothing to increase your improvement except by the arbitrary triggers of gained feats, gained skills, gained armor class, gained attack value. And these numeric things are no longer associated with the concept of the progression of the character. Now, I can tell you, if you spoke with some of my players from the third and fourth iteration dozens of years ago, they'll tell you that I awarded experience points very rarely, and generally at the end of a big story arc. And some could take that to be a form of benchmarking, but what I was really trying to effect was the idea that you don't pick up and learn things instantaneously. You pick up and learn them over time, and therefore by seeing the players utilize the things that they had been practicing made it make more sense. Now, there's still a problem, and we're coming to the point where I'm going to give you a solution that will fix all of this in one fell swoop, and it will actually let the players reestablish their own hero's journey within the games that you're running, so that you're no longer required to provide this to them. So there's really a difference between what is equitable and what is equivalent. In previous iterations, for example, in the earlier editions of Dungeons and Dragons, your wizard was incomparably worthless at low level and incredibly powerful in the late game. And this equity arc, in other words, went from low power to high power over the course of an adventure, seems to suit the hero's journey perhaps a little bit more than the fighter process, which is get a pretty high starting point and keep your advancement just statically increasing little by little. And these two would be worked out to be equitable within the game system, because the experience points earned by a wizard were lower, therefore they took longer to build, but once they got there, then the power that they would have would be unstoppable, and therefore they weren't considered to be equivalent. Now when you get to the fifth edition, the rules change, and the rules mechanism suddenly is making the players equivalent to one another right from the get-go. Now there's a challenge with that, because when you are equivalent, then there is nothing to differentiate one from the other. There's no particular cost to weight ratio, so to speak. So a player is far better improved by taking at least 1 or 2 or 3 levels of wizard in amongst the other things, because the power creep hasn't just been increased in terms of ability, but the threshold by which you jump to the higher level stuff is shorter, so therefore you end up with a more equivalent play experience. The challenge with everybody having the same play experience is that there's nothing new to be discovered. Yes, you're picking up a new spells list. Okay, that will take you all of an afternoon to figure out. You'll have, for example, a new set of skills. Again, only when they become available, and they don't do anything to add depth to the characters. As a matter of fact, it's argued that the newer versions have even less to grab a hold of in terms of cultural or ethical frameworks than the earlier editions, because now you no longer have deity involved with the concept of the clergy at all, and so it's muddied the water horribly. With all candor, the real purpose for having an experience point system at all in Dungeons & Dragons as defined has nothing to do with growth, but has everything to do with control. A game master can absolutely alter the amount of damage dealing a player group can accomplish simply by keeping a tighter grip on the experience point thresholds. And when you do this, you control your game better, which from many people's standpoint is the argument against the railroad storyline. The idea of the game master providing concurrent information to process through the game at equitable levels isn't sufficient to control the game. He has to literally restrict player advancement. And that growth versus control mechanism imbalance is what causes there to be as many players as there are who are dissatisfied with their game masters, and the number of game masters who are also throwing up their hands and stopping the process of being a storyteller altogether. All right, so now we're going to talk about the resolution. The resolution is you need to consider changing the paradigm, and by that I mean look at the experience benefits that you're utilizing and consider, instead of a flat point boost periodically, or instead of just looking at specific, or rather general character advancements, consider looking at ways that you can actively reward your players so that the basic metrics take care of themselves. The challenge, of course, with this is that now you're having to do a lot more work to determine what you should be providing to your players based on their input into your story and how much they are working towards the advancement of what's going on in the game. So the last thing I'm going to mention is you may want to consider what I've turned to, and that is the idea of the player management. So players have the agency to control which skills they advance, how often they work towards those, and what skills in particular they want to pursue so that the advancement fits what they're trying to accomplish with their character. The Nikos RPG mechanism has a built-in player management basis for all skills. Fundamentally, each time you use a skill in-game, it can improve by 1 point, regardless of your success or failure. The idea is that you thought to include that part of your story in the day-to-day play of the game, and therefore you're elevating that skill within the story in a clearly obvious way. The advantage to this is that the players determine which direction they want to go. They create their own pathway through your game so that they are no longer held or bound to your whim as far as their own advancement and what they are actually choosing to pursue. This will lead to some strange bedfellows. I'm certain there will be certain situations where a certain set of skills will become more favorable than others, and then that's where the game master's direct influence can improve or change that by allowing for example, a new kind of a reward system beyond just certain experience points that you can provide to your players. Well, so I've gotten through what I needed to get through. I want to thank you for being here today. If you like what you're hearing so far, make sure you go down and subscribe and join us on Twitch when we do these broadcasts, which are generally at 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific time, Monday through Friday. And you can also find more about our games at the links below. And as I said, I hope to see you in another one of these episodes. And as my grandfather would say, it's about time for you to go play.